Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start in the interest of time so we stay on schedule. Hello. Hello out there. My name is Alfreda Norman, and I am the Senior Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And I welcome you here to Austin and to the Investing in America's Workforce Conference. This is a day we've all been looking forward to. First, I want to recognize our conference partners, the Ray Marshall Center for Study of Human Resources at the University of Texas, the John J. Heldrick Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University, W.E. Upton Institute for Employment Research, and all 12 regional Federal Reserve banks and the Board of Governors. I also want to thank the conference planning team for the hundreds of hours of dedication that they've put into making the next 3 days a reality. There's so many details in order for all of this to work out, and I extend my gratitude to all those that have worked on this for so long. In addition to this conference, over the last year, the Reserve Banks have conducted listening sessions in 32 states with nearly 1,000 leaders who work at the intersection of workforce, training, recruitment, and finance. A report of those findings will be summarized by Philadelphia Fed President Patrick Harker in tomorrow's plenary session. I'm really looking forward to that. I hope that you will also download that report that will be made available tomorrow on what we've learned. And in addition, we're going to publish a book of essays that are written about, I think 60 authors we're working on. As we've been on this journey for about 3 years, all the banks have been thinking about workforce development, and we want to put all those learnings in the book. So I have to ask you, how many of you have downloaded the conference app? Oh, A+. Okay. All right, this is a technical and savvy audience. It is a really handy way to have the full agenda, room locations, speaker bios, and a list of conference attendees on your iPhone or iPad. If you have any trouble at all, we have a help desk. Where would we be without a help desk? There'll be a help desk at the front to help you out if you have any trouble. There is an activity feed on that mobile app to interact with other attendees in the conference, so please have a little fun with that. But just remember, that's for internal folks. So we also want to, how many of you tweet? Okay, yeah, a decent amount. Hashtags on the screen, so we would encourage you to tweet as well. And just so you know, all of the conference activities will be in this building, and the registration desk will remain open and staffed for any questions you might have during the conference. Tomorrow, that registration desk is going to be on the 3rd floor. Let's see. Oh, did you know that the conference is going to be live streamed? So you're on candid camera, in case you didn't know that. And you can let folks know back at your office that they can join us at investinwork.org. And they can see the live stream of our conference here. I also hope that you're going to join us for the reception this evening at the Blanton Art Museum. It's in walking distance. It's just out the door to the hotel and just around the corner. There'll be signs and people giving you directions to go there. I really hope you join us at the museum. We have a terrific lineup of speakers and a national audience of over 300 workforce development stakeholders from 34 states. That includes university researchers and staff, workforce development organization, policymakers, philanthropists, business leaders, community and economic development organizations, and government agencies. This is the 3rd National Workforce Conference hosted by the Federal Reserve and our partners. We've been working for the past several years to shift the perspective and change the conversation on workforce development from being a cost, a social service, or a program to being a smart investment, a talent strategy that yields positive returns for businesses, workers, and their communities. So let's get started. I'm excited. This day has been a long time coming. I can't think of anybody better to kick us off as we start this conference than Eric Belsky. Eric joined the Board of Governors in August of 2014. He became the director of the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Eric is a specialist in housing finance, economics, and policy. He oversees the Federal Reserve's work in consumer-focused supervision, research, and policy analysis with the aim of promoting a fair and transparent consumer financial services marketplace and effective community development. Before joining the Federal Reserve, he served as the managing director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. He also held the positions of Director of Housing Finance Research at Fannie Mae. He has been a senior economist at the National Association of Home Builders and taught at both Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Please join me in welcoming Eric Belsky.
So I noted you're also technically savvy. You've got an iPad for your remarks. I've got the old-fashioned paper, but it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. I want to thank Alfreda and all my colleagues across the Federal Reserve System who were involved in putting together this event. For us, it's a very significant and signature moment to have so many people who are so dedicated to addressing the nation's workforce challenges in a room together to have a conversation about how to move the field forward. And from our perspective, one of the real advantages of this is the wide range of different sectors and disciplines that are represented in the room. I was in a session in the breakout sessions that preceded this first plenary. It was a research session in which the conversation turned, I think, productively towards the issue of how do we try to coordinate across a wide range of different kinds of ideas for provision of workforce development, supports for workforce development, think more creatively about how together we can achieve some common outcomes that may be advanced by multiple stakeholders working on those challenges together. So I think it's just an enormous opportunity. I really appreciate the opportunity I've been given to speak with you today about this very important topic. And I think the title of the conference really drives home the importance of this topic. Investing in America's workforce is obviously a really essential activity for us to be engaged with as a country. It's essential to our economy, it's essential to our prosperity, and it's essential to the inclusiveness of economic opportunity in the United States. And so it really is a great honor to be with so many people who have dedicated themselves to working on this particular set of what we see as very critical issues. Alfreda mentioned that before joining the Fed, I was at an academic institution. So I'm going to say something now that I never had to say when I was at an academic institution where they assume your opinions are your own and nobody else's. But I will tell you before I start that the standard disclaimer and caveat is my remarks today are mine and not necessarily those of the Board of Governors or its members. So let me start by talking about some of the challenges, because make no mistake, I think everyone in this room recognizes there are significant challenges in better matching labor demand and supply and of eliminating slack in labor markets. And they can be formidable challenges. So beyond the very obvious one that the resources that are available to address these challenges don't seem on a scale sufficient to address not just challenges, but really these challenges all have a flip side, which represent opportunity in terms of the way that the economy could be running better and in a more productive way. But let me start by talking about the challenges we're trying to deal with and highlight four. So one is retraining and placing workers who have been dislocated from technological shifts, technological change and shifts in consumption patterns or global competition. This is the idea that the world is always changing and people may have had a set of skills or experience that were remunerated in an effective way and provided for security and employment that no longer deliver those kinds of things. The second is the challenge of helping those who do not have professional certifications, high school diplomas, or college degrees find and retain well-paying, steady jobs. Clearly and very well documented are the advantages of having some degree of higher education, certainly of a high school diploma, but the really big payoff of getting degrees beyond high school diploma. And so it's really important to help those who may not have those certifications either address them or find ways to connect with jobs that are jobs of opportunity. A third is the challenge of helping people who cannot afford to earn a post-secondary degree to do so, or to instead get the training and contacts and connections they need to find jobs of opportunity. And so there is still this view that you all in the room, I think, understand and appreciate that education is an avenue and is a route. So there's going to be some portion of people who will benefit from getting that level of training, apprenticeship training, vocational education, college degrees. But then there are going to be those that really you're not going to be able to help be able to succeed in taking the time and having the funding to do that, and connecting them to jobs of opportunity is of critical importance. And the fourth challenge, and one that I want to dwell on for a moment, is presented by persistent disparities in labor market outcomes by education, which I just talked about, but also by race, ethnicity, gender, and place. And all these things, I think, are very material challenges, these disparities, so I do want to dwell for a moment on them. I'm going to factor into my remarks here a couple of speeches that were delivered by members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and I'm going to start with one that our chair, Janet Yellen, gave back in March of this year. And she looked at the unemployment rates in lower income and minority census tracts relative to higher income tracts. And she said, for example, that according to the American Community Survey, unemployment rates from 2011 through 2015 averaged 14.3% in majority minority tracts, 13% in low income and moderate income tracts, and of course there's some disproportionate share of those tracts that are majority minority tracts, but a much lower 7.3% in higher income tracts. Why an average for 2011 and 2015, for those of you who are researchers in the room, we're hostage to the way data gets collected, and in order to get down to a census tract level, you have to actually average over a number of years. But it drives home, I think, the point of these very significant disparities. And of course, I could go on literally for an hour, 2 hours, talking about some of these disparities. We just had a very significant conference with economists that laid out these disparities. So while certainly not the only factors, gaps in educational attainment levels are important contributors to these disparities and matter when it comes to meeting workforce needs of residents in these communities. But they really are a wide range of other challenges. The reality is there are a lot of people in the United States who have just lived a life in which they've been disadvantaged in a variety of different ways. I was having a conversation with a colleague this morning and reminded how many of those people are not only disadvantaged, but they've been underestimated in terms of their abilities and talents in ways that really are not in anyone's best interest and are not productive for the United States economy. That's why I think it's important to talk about some of these issues. So in places that are struggling more generally with higher unemployment and lower labor force participation rates among prime working age adults, workforce development must often be twinned with other kinds of investments in community development, economic development, financial inclusion. I'm sure you'll fill in others that I haven't in your mind, that there are some places that just really are struggling with these weaker economies, and some places that are struggling with contextual factors in their communities that really need to be addressed for workforce development. So while workforce development certainly is not a panacea, it can make meaningful difference in meeting all the challenges I just talked about. Furthermore, one of the things that I think is really compelling about workforce development efforts, it's often aimed at the root causes of the issues that we're trying to address by providing relevant training, education, apprenticeships, and internships, basic skills development, and helping connect workers and employers. So it's really getting at what are the challenges around people connecting with an income, a steady income that's just so essential for lots of aspects of their lives and essential for the economy and for the matching of the labor and supply demand sides of the market. So in the current labor market, there are also large numbers of lower paying and often part-time jobs which don't provide benefits, predictable schedules, or certain benefits. And for that reason, it really is also important that workforce development not only try to get at some of what are considered sort of the more direct causes of people needing to have some intermediary that helps connect them with an employer or to develop a certain set of skills and experience, but also to provide supports to workers, and especially people who have kids who are trying to make part-time jobs work that may have schedules that don't line up. And those are things like transportation, childcare, housing, wellness services that help people remain in their jobs once they're able to connect with work. Indeed, there are real opportunities for us to do better job of matching job providers with job seekers and aligning skills and education to evolving labor market demands. There really are still, I think, even in an economy where we have what would be considered a relatively low unemployment rate nationally, clear pockets where they're higher, and still we're trying to understand what does maximum employment really mean, that there really are these opportunities to try to create these by making more direct pathways between employers and workers. Just last week, Chair Yellen visited a workforce development initiative in Cuyahoga County Community College that they run that provides classroom training on machining techniques, and upon completion of that training, students are guaranteed a paid internship with a partnership employer. This usually leads to a full-time job with benefits, and I think many of you, given the decentralized nature of our workforce development system, have experienced just those kinds of things in your own community. Another indication of the interest that the Fed has in these. There are also real opportunities to reduce disparities in labor market outcomes by the things I talked about: race and place, ethnicity, gender, in wages, unemployment rates, separation rates, labor force participation rates. And finally, there are real opportunities to lift the productivity and innovativeness of the workforce through investing wisely in the people who make it up. And I trust that the people in this room especially have the same sense of urgency that I have about the importance of seizing these opportunities given shifts in labor demand brought about by technological change and by global competition, as well as the potential to reduce these very, very persistent disparities in labor market outcomes. So, of course, the Fed, with its statutory dual mandate, which is a dual mandate from Congress of stable prices and maximum employment, has a very keen interest in this topic and in these subjects. The Federal Reserve System aims to chart a course that achieves this dual mandate, and as part of meeting this aim, its economists conduct research intended to illuminate how to construe when there is slack in the labor market and where there is slack in the labor market. And as I said, I was going to refer to two speeches. Just last week, Governor Lael Brainerd had this to say about the disparities in labor market outcomes and why it matters to economic potential and growth. And I'm going to quote from her remarks. To the extent that disparities in income and wealth across gender, racial, and ethnic groups and geography reflect disparities in opportunity, families and small businesses from the disadvantaged groups will underinvest in education or business endeavors, and potential growth will fall short of the levels it might otherwise attain. So part of that dual mandate is a view that we really want to do what we can to optimize that economic growth. Her remarks also allude to the opportunity for mobilizing around workforce development. So again, I'm going to quote, "At a time when the retirement of the baby boom generation looks likely to be something of a drag on the growth of the labor force, it is especially important to consider whether relatively low levels of employment and labor force participation for some prime working age groups represent slack that, if successfully tapped, could increase the labor force and boost economic growth. So from where we sit at the Fed, we see this as a potentially economic growth enhancing set of activities. Clearly, we need to think about how best to invest in our workforce in ways that support the full productive potential of the economy, and that additional research on labor markets should help us get to those results. The Federal Reserve, therefore, has an active research agenda around labor market outcomes, but it also has a very active agenda associated with supporting workforce development efforts across the country. So where did this, how did we get to this day? And I would say that while the Fed has had a longstanding interest in these issues, coming out of the financial crisis, I think for reasons that are fairly obvious, the work intensified. When employment rates were that elevated across all 12 Reserve Bank districts, each focused more intensively themselves on understanding human capital and workforce development needs. This led to a deeper appreciation not only of the challenges of the cyclically unemployed, but also the long-term unemployed, and of those who are discouraged from participating in the labor force. So this attention to workforce development led across the system to a number of innovative contributions to research and knowledge sharing. These include a Federal Reserve report at the Board of Governors on young workers, a publication on opportunity occupations done by 2 Reserve Banks, a conference called Transforming Workforce Development Policy in the 21st Century, which culminated in an edited volume, which if you haven't seen or looked at, I would commend to you. I found it very worthwhile to read. And we also had a series of meetings with presidents of historically black colleges and universities. We, at the Federal Reserve Bank, formed a partnership with others to address smaller cities called working cities and creating employment opportunities in those cities. These and other resources are all on the website, investinwhatwork.org. I don't know how we got so lucky to actually find that domain name not already taken, or maybe you guys paid some fortune to get it, I don't know. But it's easy, it's catchy to remember, and there are a lot of really great tools and resources there. This conference, as it's been noted on their website, is a capstone of a 2-year initiative that really accelerated this work and drew on all 12 Reserve Banks, which isn't all that common, actually, an occurrence across the Federal Reserve System, and speaks to the seriousness with which we take this issue. During this past year, as you heard, the Fed had organized listening sessions all across the country. You'll hear more about that tomorrow. Also this year, I want to point out that the Federal Reserve Banks of Dallas and Kansas City collaborated on an important publication that lays out how banks can engage in workforce development in ways that will receive credit. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act, it's an act that places an affirmative obligation on all banks that get federal deposit insurance to meet the business and credit needs of their communities. And in 2016, the 3 regulators that are responsible for CRA made clear in the form of questions and answers or guidance that workforce development can receive consideration under certain circumstances, and this publication went into a great deal of detail that we think was helpful in that regard. In addition to other activities planned for next year, as you heard, one of them will be preparing yet a second book that draws together a series of ideas and tries to move the field forward, in no small part based on people participating in this event today, tomorrow, and the next day. So let me end my remarks with discussing why the 12 Federal Reserve Banks and the academic partners in this event framed this as workforce development as an investment. From my perspective, this makes perfect sense, of course, because the intention of investments in America's workforce is to earn returns in the form of a variety of very important things: a productive workforce, reduced unemployment rates, lower search costs, and better matches for workers and employers. So you're going to hear a lot about this notion of workforce development as an investment, and this isn't the first place I'm sure you're hearing this. This is something that has been gaining steam and momentum. And this focus on investing in things that produce outcomes and investing for results is really part of a much broader evolution of both financing mechanisms and a larger movement to measure the effectiveness of different strategies in producing outcomes across a very wide range of public policy matters and topics. In fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco just released a book this year called What Matters? Investing in Results, and it's a collection of papers on outcomes-based approach to social investments. There's one piece in there on workforce development specifically, because this drew across this wide range of public policy issues and matters. And it's a really, I think, compelling argument as to why focusing on outcomes matters. In the workforce development space, this means focusing on things like long-term, moving the long-term unemployed into lasting employment, producing sustained increases in wages, reducing the number of employers reporting difficulties in filling positions with qualified applicants, and reducing turnover. An outcomes-based approach has a lot of advantages, so I want to name three. Then I'm going to talk about a few challenges and why I think the challenges are worth taking on, because I do think an outcomes-based approach is a productive way to move in the future. One is it brings an essential focus on tackling the multidimensional causes of problems and investing in sustainable solutions to them. When you're trying to get to these outcomes, you realize it takes a lot of different kinds of things to really maximize your effectiveness, and I talked about that earlier in my remarks. Two, it demands that each of us think more concretely about outcomes we are aiming to achieve through our investments in workforce development, and I think thinking concretely about them is useful, and they're typically very nuanced. Again, that paper in the book on workforce development talks about how important it is to appreciate that nuance. And three, it focuses on metrics that enables us to test the effectiveness of different strategies and narrow in on scaling those strategies that seem to have the most promise, produce the best and the most demonstrable results. And I think that's also a critical aspect of this. And in fact, a variety of funding models are available now and have been piloted that are geared towards funding initiatives that have a higher probability of success, such as social impact bonds. And in a world in which, as I said, probably the greatest constraint is resources available to do good and important work that produces real outcomes, you need to think about how you can try to bring more funding into the space. The opportunity before this group is to define and organize around those sustainable outcomes, but there are challenges too. First, to move the needle, we need to challenge ourselves to identify and address, as I said, the root causes of problems so we can create lasting solutions. And in this context, you'll get some people who will say the root causes of things stretch far earlier than when we encounter people trying to engage in the workforce, and that they come with a history that needs to be addressed in the form of early childhood interventions and middle childhood interventions. In fact, the Federal Reserve also had a system conference on that subject just recently. Second, the providers and funders among us may face challenges in organizing and collaborating around multidimensional interventions that are often needed to improve the effectiveness of workforce investments. That's a very placid way of saying that our system is really not organized around these kind of multi-sectoral approaches. Funding follows particular streams. Funding has its own set of rules around those streams, government funding in particular. And really figuring out how you create an ecosystem that supports that kind of work is pretty challenging, in fact. And again, a topic of conversation in the session I had just attended. Third, funders will be challenged to be patient when investing in outcomes that may take time to achieve, and lots of funders are under a lot of pressure to show that the investments they're making are producing results maybe more quickly than you can reasonably expect them to be realized. Fourth, funders and providers will be challenged to agree on reasonable measures of success. And this is really very important, and I'll throw that in. It's so important I'm going to describe it as the fifth factor, even though I just described it to you as the fourth factor. And last and most importantly, it challenges the field to assess the current and future skills the economy will demand, and set realistic expectations about success. Because I think being too present focused on the composition of labor demand today risks not anticipating how that's evolving and changing in sometimes quicker ways. But it's really important that we not be Pollyannish about what can be achieved. That really doesn't serve us very well. People have to be realistic. We're in a world in which the success rate is far below 100%, and wrapping our minds around what that means and how that varies by different kinds of groups that we're trying to serve is very important. To me, the reasons for focusing on outcomes are truly compelling, and they're worthy of tackling the challenges that have to be overcome to do it. It's a worthy aim to focus on longer-term solutions, I think, quite obviously, that do more than deal with the consequences of poverty and community distress, which is where a lot of the work is focused, but instead helps people and communities actually overcome them by connecting them to gainful employment. I mean, the importance of income and a job is so fundamental in people's lives, but in also communities and community lives. This is a field and a set of work and initiatives that offers real potential to be able to make a difference, because as people get those incomes, they can spend more on other aspects of community services that communities need. And it's a worthy aim to truly reduce labor market frictions and imperfections associated with matching workforce skills and experience and demands for them. So this conference is an opportunity for all of us to explore all those themes. I, like Alfreda, and I think everyone in the room, is really looking forward to what's going to transpire over the next couple of days. It's wonderful to know that what is being done here, I think, will be captured not only by each of you individually, but hopefully you'll reach out to maybe some people that you didn't know, some sectors you didn't know, some aspects of the problem that you hadn't considered, and come back stronger and renewed in doing that. And gathering the ideas together in a book will allow this conference and the work that went into it to extend much beyond that. And given our colleagues' interest in communications, I have no doubt that we'll do a great job in getting that disseminated in broad ways. And one of the nice things about the Federal Reserve is, everything we do is up on the web for anyone to access. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I think I'm turning it back to Alfreda, and looking forward to the first panel. It's going to be really illuminating. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to have our first panel, Daniel Davis, coming up to the front. Here he is. Daniel is the Community Development Officer of the St. Louis Fed, and he is going to moderate our panel here, and they're going to make the business case for investment in workforce development.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to Alfreda just for the warm welcome to this gathering, and thank you to Eric for just offering tremendous context for us as we dive into our first panel of today. I'm Daniel Davis with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and it's a real honor just to be sitting here and having this conversation with the panel that we brought together today. It really is meant to be a conversation amongst the people who are on the panel, but also with you, the audience. So as we go throughout the session today, do be thinking about those questions that you have as you want to engage in the conversation with the folks up here on the stage as well. I remember Alfreda and Eric both mentioned how this conference, this gathering, has been a work in progress over a long duration of time, and it really is the capstone of an initiative that all 12 of the Federal Reserve banks and the Board of Governors are engaged in. And I remember about a year ago, or just over a year ago, gathering with a group of conference organizers here in Austin, here at the University of Texas, and having a conversation about how do we frame really this piece of the conversation that's so important. Eric offered the context as to why the focus is there, but how do we frame it? And if you look at the subhead on the screen, it really tried to understand that the workforce system has dual clients, right? There's the employers and there are the workers. And so we've made a very conscious decision to start out the conversation today by having a conversation with employers, to begin right there, because we know that they make up an important piece of the workforce system. I sat down with a member of my team who focuses on workforce development last week. I asked the question about how do we quantify the investment that employers are making in the workforce system. And we tried to look at the academic literature, tried to unpack it, and we found a study by Georgetown that looked at trying to quantify the investment of the employers. And in a US system that's spending about $1.1 trillion on workforce investments, employers are responsible for about half of that. A percentage of that is focused on formal training, and that's up about 26% since even the early 90s. But a big percentage of that takes place in informal training that happens right there that the workforce employers are providing. So we want to get right into the conversation today. We're going to try to unpack why is it that employers are a part of this investment process? What are some of the trends and strategies that are taking place? And so before we go much further, I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, to share the organization that they come from and the perch from which they're sitting today as you're hearing comments from them. So Rocky, if we could start with you.
Thank you. I'm John or Rocky Barret. I'm the tribal chairman of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, an American Indian tribe based in Shawnee, Oklahoma. We have 33,000 citizens in our tribe. We employ about a little over 2,500 people in 14 separate private or non-governmental enterprises, and we operate approximately 35 federal contracts and compacts with the federal government. The range of people that we employ goes all the way from minimum wage up to, of course, the physicians and much higher paid people. I was born in Shawnee and graduated from Shawnee High School. I had the opportunity my senior year of high school to attend Oklahoma Baptist University, and through that I was able to become a member of the class of '66 at Princeton University. That back when it was an all-male school. I'm married and came back to Oklahoma City University and University of Oklahoma and finished my undergraduate, did my graduate work there, and I have been involved in some way with St. Gregory's University for some time, who made the mistake of awarding me with a doctorate in commercial sciences honorary. But I mostly have been interested in helping to transform Indian country and help Indian tribes overcome what is the absolute problem that Indian country suffers, which is a brain drain, I guess you would call it. We don't provide opportunity for our best and brightest, and learning how to bring those people back. One, how to educate them, how to interest them in doing something for the tribe. Then after they are educated and gain some experience, how they can contribute to the tribe's well-being. And being in charge of a workforce and being empowered by my tribe to do so, of a workforce that is approximately 1/3 Citizen Potawatomi, another smaller percentage up to about a half that are other tribes, and the remaining number of our workforce are non-Indians. And how do you work in an organization where 1/3 of the people there are blood relatives? And how do you avoid those 5 or 6 generation-year-old feuds that started with your great-great-grandfather? People don't like you because their great-grandpa didn't like your great-grandpa, kind of thing. And working in an environment where there is a sense of entitlement because you are a member of the tribe, and a and essentially one of the owners of the assets that are around you. When I went to work for the tribe in 1973 as vice chairman, my uncle was the chairman, we had $550 in the bank, $75 a month coming in. We had a telephone for a week. We were using a borrowed and abandoned construction trailer from the Corps of Engineers for a tribal office. We met once a quarter and enrolled people. And beyond that, we didn't have much business to conduct. And we were operating under an antiquated form of government imposed on us by the federal government that was a recipe for failure. And we suffered under that for quite some time until I was able to get our Constitution amended to at least allow us not to reinvent the wheel and actively shoot ourselves in the foot every couple of months, or every couple of years in particular. And so I was really honored to be invited to be a part of this panel. Mr. Davis of the Federal Reserve Bank and Ms. Schumacher of McDonald's and Ms. Crozier of IBM and Ms. Harris of Prudential. And I sort of feel like this is a tuxedo and I'm a pair of brown shoes. Why am I here?
Well, I think you've given us amazing context, Rocky, for why you're here, exactly the experience that you bring into this conversation. And I know we're so curious to dig more deeply into understanding what's going on in the area where you're working. But just curious, Shawni, go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Shawni Harris and I'm Vice President of Corporate Giving at Prudential Financial. We are part of the corporate social responsibility team, and in my role, I lead all the cash giving for the CSR team, and that includes the work of the Prudential Foundation. So a big part of our philanthropic strategy is really centered around eliminating barriers of financial and social mobility for underserved populations. So when you think about that, when you think about what creates ladders of opportunities for people, connecting people to quality jobs is core, a very core strategy. So we invest heavily in strategies that help people build skills that are demand-driven and industry-focused. And we also invest in policies that really help to provide incentives to improve employment practices, and also really create a more seamless alignment between the education system and the workforce development system, which I know many of you are grappling with. And equally important is this idea of quality employment. So I know many of us are grappling with how to place people in jobs, but we're really trying to push the envelope on what does it mean to have quality employment, something that many of us, probably all of us, enjoy in this room. So what does it mean to have a livable wage? What does it mean to have quality benefits? And what does it mean to have opportunities to develop and grow your careers? So I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation today and then talk a little more about what Prudential's doing to contribute to solutions in that area.
Thanks, Shawni. Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Crozier with IBM. And first of all, thank you to the Federal Reserve System for having us and to you for pulling this panel together. IBM is the biggest tech employer in the United States. We spend about $1 billion on workforce development and are investing in that within this country. And I'm very glad to be a part of this conversation because we are really challenged with the skills crisis in America. And we know that while there are 500,000 tech jobs sitting open in the country, there are only 50,000 people graduating with computer science degrees. And so when we think about this issue at IBM, we think about
Wow, just turned you on. Oh, hi. Okay. I'm turned on now. Let's try it again. Should I start at the beginning?
Doing just fine.
Great. All right. Biggest tech company in America, major skills crisis. And so when we think about the skills crisis, we think about what we describe as a term that's grew in popularity at IBM because we said it's not white collar jobs, it's not blue collar jobs, it's new collar jobs. And what does that mean? It means that we need to source talent from places that are sort of unusual and new for us. It might be from community colleges, it might be from coding camps, it might be ways that people are learning online in really interesting ways. But what we know is that we have a major skills gap to close, that we are hungry for talent, and at the same time that youth and people across demographics in this country need jobs. So I wear two hats at IBM from my perch. One is I head up IBM Citizenship and Corporate Social Responsibility. I'm also president of the IBM Foundation and think about our philanthropic contributions. And we can talk more about the work that we're doing in that space. But I think what I'm interested in chatting about today is how we're investing in our existing workforce and then what we're doing to grow the workforce of the future.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Lisa.
Hi, and apparently I'm the AV person.
All right,
for the
thanks.
panel.
Thanks for that.
So I'm Lisa Schumacher. I'm the Director of Education Strategies at McDonald's Corporation. Probably do not have to tell anybody who McDonald's is. But I will tell you we have 14,000 restaurants across the U.S., which are primarily, about 95% primarily owned by our independent franchisees who employ about 800 to 850,000 people in this country alone. As the Director of Education Strategies, I'm looking specifically at how do we help people in our restaurants sort of navigate their way along that education pathway. So we're looking at how do we help people learn English language skills, how do we help people reach that high school graduation level, get a high school diploma, potentially how do we help people get to a 2 or 4-year degree, and then how do we create sort of support systems around that, again, to help them navigate that system. I'm thrilled to be here because I think it's an opportunity for me to potentially change people's perception about entry-level jobs and maybe specifically about a job at McDonald's and what that can provide. So when we talk about filling middle skills jobs and we talk about talent pools, let's start thinking about entry-level jobs and the employers who employ those folks as potential talent pools for those middle skill jobs.
So let's dive right into that. So
Yeah.
we do think about McDonald's, I think, so often as the early training grounds for so much of the workforce. And I know there's been conversations around how beginning your job at McDonald's, you develop those soft skills of showing up to work, working a schedule, learning accountability, following instructions to get things done. I'm curious to know about McDonald's strategy, your workforce development strategy. Why do you take the approach that you do, especially when you've just acknowledged it's often the first employer, or the early employer for so many individuals? How does McDonald's think about workforce development then?
Yeah, so I would frame McDonald's perspective like this. So, we know, as all of you know, that there's an education gap in this country and there's a skills gap in this country. And we really feel like because of our size and scale, we can be part of the solution to both of those challenges. Given that we employ hundreds of thousands of people in our restaurants, we have a role in shaping the workforce of tomorrow and helping to grow the workforce of tomorrow. And so to your point about soft skills or job readiness skills, as we often call them, I guess I would argue that there's probably no better place to learn those job readiness skills than a job at McDonald's. And now, in addition to those job readiness skills that are inherently learned as part of your job as a cashier or making french fries or working the drive-thru, which, by the way, if none of you have ever done that job, it's a hard job. And anybody start their career in retail or food service? Anybody start their first job at McDonald's? There we go. We got 2, all right. They're hard jobs. I mean, sit at a McDonald's and watch folks work. It's not an easy thing to do. I know when I first started working there 4 years ago and I had to spend a day in a restaurant working the drive-thru, I was sweating profusely and anxious, and I was going to give somebody the wrong order, and it's a hard job. So in addition to learning those job skills, those job readiness skills, we now give people the opportunity to move their way along that educational journey. And so we offer English as a second language classes, which we call English Under the Arches. People are paid for their time in class. It's a hybrid delivery model, so it really meets their needs. There's face-to-face and virtual classes. They go through as a cohort, so they have a community around them helping them through that class. And certainly what we've seen as a result of that is an impact on the business. So retention rates increase when our franchisees invest in folks going through that class. We've had over 5,000 people, McDonald's restaurant employees, graduate from English Under the Arches. But probably the most impactful is what they say at the end of the class, right? I now feel comfortable talking to my child's teacher or my child's doctor. So it's not just about, being a better McDonald's or being a better McDonald's employee. It's about helping them along that journey. We also recognize that of the estimated 40 million plus working adults in this country who don't have a high school diploma, a decent percentage of them probably work in our restaurants. And so we put in place an online high school diploma completion process. And as of this morning, we've had 212 people. We've been at this for about 2 years, so 212 folks who have received their high school diploma. And I will tell you that I often sit at my desk with tears in my eyes because every story is more compelling than the next. It's no cost to them. It's no cost to our franchisees. And then on the college side, we look at really affordability and accessibility. How do we help people make that step or make that step again in many cases? So the kind of normal stuff like tuition assistance, but we designed it as assistance so that people get the money up front, right? Because we thought about people in our restaurants and what's that first barrier to them going to school. It's that out-of-pocket expense. All of our management curriculum we articulate into our college partners so that folks don't have to take classes that they've already basically taken at McDonald's. And then importantly, we added education advising to that portfolio because we know sort of the state, the abysmal, if I can say so, abysmal state of academic advising in this country. We wanted to really help people navigate that system so that they weren't sort of, shelling out money and having nothing to show for at the end. So all that support that probably all of us in this room had, right, navigating that very complicated higher education system. Many folks in our restaurants are first generation and don't have that support, or they're low income and they're in a high school that doesn't have those supports. So all of our folks in our restaurants now have access to, at no cost again, academic advising. So it's really, looked at who are the people in our restaurants, what are their needs, and how can we, again, be part of the solution to both the education gap and the skills gap. And it has, at least in the last 2 years, proven to be successful from the perspective of our restaurant employees and also from the perspective of our franchisees. They see not only the business return around retention, recruitment capability, but also the impact that it has on their communities.
You articulated so well that because of your size, you can be part of the solution and how that's really part of your focus with this workforce strategy. And Jen, I think a reoccurring theme is going to pop up with you as well. I mean, you mentioned that IBM is the largest tech employer in the United States.
Right.
It's a highly competitive, a highly technical field. Curious how you at IBM are thinking about workforce development, what your strategy is, and how you are bringing more people into these new collar jobs, as you've just coined it.
Right, absolutely. So again, it's a balance of investing in our existing workforce and then thinking further down the line. But one of the programs we're really proud about is a program called P-TECH. So 6 years ago, we looked at the national averages of community college graduation rates, which were, abysmal. They varied by state to state, but the number of people that start community college and then make it to the finish line, there's a big delta there. And so we said, what if there was a school that started at grade 9 at the beginning of high school, but went all the way through grade 14? And what if that school, it had some partners, industry partners, that helped shape the curriculum so that it was actually retrofitted based on what people would be hiring for. So if we say, what will IBM be hiring for in 6 years? Let's make sure that there are those points in the curriculum so when you get out. And what if every student in that school had an industry mentor? And what if along the way they got workplace experiences? And what if they got summer internships? And what if there was a company that would stand up and be first in line to hire them at the end if they get their degree and all the skills they need? And so we partnered with Mayor Bloomberg in New York City and the City University of New York to build the first P-TECH school in Brooklyn. We were very excited about the model, and so was Rahm Emanuel, who said, Bloomberg's got one, I'll take 5 for Chicago. So we were off to the races there. and then back to New York with Governor Cuomo chasing after it. And the next thing we knew, President Obama was speaking about it in the State of the Union. And we're pleased that now we have close to 100, we'll have 100 by next year, P-TECH schools across the United States. Actually, in Australia, they're putting this model up as well, and we'll be launching a school in Morocco because there's been so much interest in the model. Now, this conference is about outcomes. And IBM, we're really big on data and outcomes. And so 6 years later, we're now able to look at, okay, so you did this, so what? So our first cohort of students graduated from the school in Brooklyn and Chicago this year. I had the pleasure to go to the graduation events in Chicago, which were just unbelievably moving. Because these are low-income students. This isn't a charter school. This is a standard public school. There's no cherry picking. And these are students who might not have made it to an associate's degree statistically, but they all did. The completion rate is 4 times the national average. The test scores are off the charts. What we're finding is that our goal is to not only make them career ready, but college ready. And many of the students, actually, I was pleased to see when they got there, many of them chose to go on and pursue a 4-year degree. But that was a possibility for them because the first 2 years, the associate's degree, were free. So they weren't saddled by, the kind of loans that you would see in other situations. And they also knew that they already had skills to be able to get meaningful, higher value jobs. We, true to our word, hired many of the first graduates. We have a number of those working for us at IBM. We have others that have gone on to work with partner companies. So when I say there's going to be 100 schools by next year, and I think we have 80 of them up and running right now, those aren't all IBM schools. We're not like creating a conveyor belt of future IBMers that are just getting stamped out. We have partnered with 400 other companies who have stood up to say, well, what if there was a school for the hospitality industry? Well, what if there was a school for biotech? Well, we're not that big of a company. We can't mentor. I can't provide a mentor to every student in a school. So could 5 companies go in together on a school? Okay, that could work. So there's been a lot of flexibility in that approach. We're really excited about the partnerships, and most importantly, we're excited about the outcomes and the jobs and the future for these students.
Thanks for that, Jen. I want to turn to you, Shawni, because you have, Prudential is certainly doing work with your current workforce, but I think a spin that you bring into this conversation is how invested Prudential is in the communities that you serve.
Absolutely.
And the way that you're taking a proactive role in establishing workforce development, helping people think about the quality jobs, quality qualifications that can lead to those jobs. Can you talk a bit more about what you're doing at Prudential and that unique spin of how you're impacting the communities where you're located, not just the workforce that's working for you?
Absolutely. So Prudential was established over 140 years ago in Newark, New Jersey. So if anyone knows the city of Newark, it's a city and a community that's high need. It has high unemployment rates. But a community that Prudential really feels deeply about being anchored into that community. We see it as our hometown, and as a member of the community, as an anchor organization, an institution, how do we support strategies that holistically increase outcomes for residents? So a place-based strategy is really core to how we do our philanthropy. And you'll hear more later on in the conference of some strategies that are working in Newark, really looking at collaborating with anchor institutions, so Prudential, Rutgers. There are a number of anchor institutions in the city that are really looking at how do you increase local hiring practices, how do you look to invest more in local businesses so that you can look at procurement strategies as a vehicle to help expand local businesses, but also to hire residents. And how do we look holistically about strengthening community and creating platforms and tables that engage across sector of stakeholders in dealing with this complex issue? Because it can't be solved by just one institution, one industry. You really need a comprehensive approach. And that work has occurred in Newark, but it occurs in other places. And we do a lot in terms of our philanthropic work to align with our businesses, to really look at kind of shared value goals that create a win-win. So before I came here, I was actually in El Paso, Texas, which is a new community for Prudential. So we have invested in an IT technology center in El Paso, one of 3 that we have globally. So we are headquartered in Newark, and we have a big presence there. But our primary kind of IT center for the company has been in Letterkenny, Ireland. So there was a thought that we probably needed another domestic footprint. And for a lot of reasons, the company identified El Paso, Texas as a great opportunity to grow the company and the presence locally. So we started 3 years ago with 150 employees, and that has expanded, and we're on target to grow to almost 1,000 employees in El Paso. And the, thank you. We're proud of that. So, we've looked at a number of business metrics on what makes sense for that. But, important to our values as a company is this opportunity to really look at diverse talent pipelines. So how do we look at vulnerable populations, people who have had barriers for employment, whether they're veterans or military spouses, or people of color, which El Paso has a large, diverse population. And how do we intentionally look at creating talent pipelines that would benefit our business? And how our team has really linked with our business leaders is to really prove the case that if you invest holistically, if you really look at extending the talent pipeline and investing early, that you can create a very seamless process to recruit talent, strong talent in the communities. So we made a series of investments, starting at the elementary and middle school grades, working with community partners like the YWCA in the community, all the way up until the university. So working with partners like UTEP, the community college there, really looking at high school and middle school strategies to invest in careers that are in demand for Prudential. So for us, in that particular business center, it would be IT and increasingly kind of math and technology careers like actuarial sciences or risk management, which is something that the company really considers. So how do you invest throughout that pipeline so that you can imbue and increase math skills for elementary and high school students? How do you really look at workers at the community college level? How do you accelerate skill building that allows them to immediately plug into pipelines and opportunities with Prudential? And at the university level, we created an actuary science program, really working with our business leaders so that we could recruit the best and the brightest. Many young people who were not even clear on what was actuarial science, what were actual tangible careers that would move this continuum. And it's been amazing. It was great to see. We actually went to the YWCA and looked at a couple of programs. And it's not just for making sure that young people are on track to stay in school and graduate from school with the skills and the training needed for careers. But it's also focusing on getting people back on track. So we have invested in opportunity youth that are currently incarcerated, so that they have opportunities once they exit the system. And that has led to deep business engagement from our business leaders. One of the things that happens often when Prudential executives visit El Paso is our team connects them with a community partner. So you may have the head of our U.S. business operating system sitting down at the community college really talking about the work that they're doing. You have our HR professionals really targeting and very intentionally looking to highlight careers and opportunities and really pull from the pool of partners that we're working in. And this is not only good for Prudential, it's good for El Paso. It allows the city to continue to be competitive, to continue to bring in other industries. So we're really happy of that, but I think it takes a very holistic approach to community building. and really looking at what's good for a community rather than just the business objectives that we may have as a company.
You know, Shawni, Eric Belsky mentioned in his opening remarks about how important it is that we look at investments in areas where there are significant disparities. And he pointed out race and ethnicity and gender, and then also place, which I think you've hit all of that to some degree as you've talked about the pipeline of workers to be created, and then also very specific place-based efforts in Newark and El Paso. And Rocky, I want to turn to you, because it seems that what you're doing as well is trying to focus in on a very specific place-based initiative. I mean, your Citizen Potawatomi Nation is engaged in so many endeavors, and you spoke about some of them, but everything from grocery stores to banks to community development financial institution to casinos. Can you speak just a bit more about what the workforce development strategy is for you as you lead this group?
Well, on the aspects of place, we are where we are, not by choice. We were put there, and
exactly.
And we can't leave. That is our tribal jurisdiction, our governmental territory, by edict of the United States Congress. We are the most treated tribe in U.S. history. We've had almost 50 treaties with the United States government, all of them broken, and we are also on relocation number 4. We started in the Great Lakes, and we have a long tradition, entrepreneurial tradition, and early married in 1700s, intermarried with the French, and were part of the French fur trade and establishing commerce on the Great Lakes. Unfortunately sided with the French against the English, and then with the English against the colonials, and we on the wrong side of a couple of wars. But once, in all of that time, at each time that it came time for the government to take our land away from us, and I'm the product, I think, of that sounds remote and a long time ago, but I'm the product of a family of people I knew. My great-grandparents were, they had their land taken from them in Kansas. We were moved from the Great Lakes to, and were part of the suit with the government at the time that Chief Justice Marshall ruled in the Georgia cases. We found out that citizens, unless you were U.S. citizens, you couldn't go to court in the United States and defend your ownership of the land. We were told under the Jackson Removal Act that we had to leave Indiana, but we thought we were entitled to compensation for every grist mill that was on the river, every trading post, every ferry across the river, every inn, every single means of commerce, plus a tremendous amount of developed land. We thought we were entitled to compensation for that. And so we had a private bill before Congress, and were told that we didn't have many choices but to leave. And so some 4 years after the date we were supposed to leave, they said, okay, we're going to settle with you. And we gathered at the courthouse at Twin Lakes, Indiana, that we had built. And all of the leadership of the tribe, of the different villages, and chiefs of the different bands, and the principal chiefs all gathered to settle with the government. And as we were talking, we heard the rattle of sabers and the sound of horses, and the place was surrounded, and all of the heads of family and chiefs were clapped in irons. And we began walking the next morning after the troops were sent out to burn all of the homes and farms and crops and businesses. Started walking to Kansas. And we arrived there in late winter, lost a fourth of our people on the way, and another fourth of the people in the winter, because when we got there, with no guns, no horses, no tools, no food, no shelter, it was pretty tough on us. Then, being right on the Missouri border, we started doing the same things we had done in history before that. We built ferries across the different rivers. We established trading posts. We went back into business, back into commerce. The old joke about among Indians is other Indians say how, and Potawatomi say how much. At any rate, we started with the businesses again, but unfortunately, we also, not unfortunately, actually fortunately, we bordered on a slave state, and we became deeply involved in the Underground Railroad. It was no mistake that John Brown's military forces were called the Potawatomi Rifles, that the raid on Lawrence was based from Potawatomi Creek. And so we were deeply involved in helping slaves avoid Missouri. Before that, when Buchanan and Pierce, who were Copperhead presidents, who were northern-born pro-South presidents, when they became president, they allowed our lands to be taken at gunpoint from us, and we were dislocated entirely. The government then awarded us another reservation over around Topeka, and then all of a sudden, a young railroad lawyer who was working on the rights-of-way for the railroads that were built across this country during a Civil War, a guy named Abraham Lincoln, he came and found that the land that we had was an ideal place to grant a 100-mile wide right-of-way to the railroad, and all of the timber and resources of that right-of-way would be used to finance the railroad and the Civil War. And so we were displaced from Kansas, and were allowed, though, to, since we had chosen in 1861 to form a new tribe then called the Citizen Band Potawatomi, and be the first tribe to take United States citizenship as a body, so we could go to court to defend our ownership of our property. Didn't work. So we lost the property anyway. And in 1867, we took the compensation that we got for what wasn't on the railroad right away, and we bought this place in Oklahoma that was taken away from the Seminoles as punishment for fighting on the side of the South. And basically, it's a 40 by 50 mile area, and it is essentially one half of the 11th poorest county in Oklahoma, about half of it of which doesn't have drinkable water. And so we moved down to Oklahoma, but we couldn't go right away, because if you were on the road about 1867, 1868, George Armstrong Custer would ride down on your village and kill all the women and children, and General Sherman was in charge of removal. If you was quoted in the Philadelphia papers as saying, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," that's his quote. And when asked how he could justify killing Indian children, he said, "Nits make lies." So the attitude of the government at the time of our removal, we didn't go in 67 because it wasn't safe to be on the road, but in 1872 we got to Oklahoma, and we did the same thing. We went back into the businesses that we had always been in, and since there was no law, Fort Smith was the closest, we set up a government and laws and were citizens of the United States. In spite of that, and were given essentially, since we paid cash for the land, a deed to this piece of land, some 440,000 acres. Unfortunately, when they passed the Allotment Act of 1889, they said, no, that didn't work out. You get 80 acres apiece, and the rest of it we're going to open for a land run. So about less than half of it was not allotted out to individual Indians, and they had a land run, and there was a considerable amount of controversy over who was on what piece of land. But at that time, there was a fairly strong resistance on the part of the tribe and of rural Potawatomi County to to the draft in World War I, and so there, because of prior history, and there was a formation of two separate tribal governments, and our tribe split for some time. And luckily, we got back together again, but we were on the list under the Eisenhower administration to be terminated. And 60 tribes were simply terminated out of existence by the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s.
So Rocky, I'm hearing this, and I'm understanding just the challenge that you're working within.
Well, actually what happened was, unlike these other folks, we didn't have to figure out how we were going to train people or how we were going to anything else. First thing we had to convince people to do is whether they were going to go to work at all.
Yeah.
Because we had been living in an environment where what work you could get, it was determined that if you left your land in trust, you could be deemed by the agency superintendent. This was after my grandfather was born. The agency superintendent could deem you an incompetent to conduct your own affairs, and you couldn't have a bank account, sign contracts, or manage the revenues from your property. So there was a tremendous move on the part of Potawatomis to take all this land out of trust, and then in 1904 they announced, well, the only jurisdiction the tribe has left is land that's left in trust. And so we had about 4,000 acres of land that was individually owned by people who couldn't be found or were young or underage or were incompetent. And we had in common 2½ acres of land as a tribe and no building. And so we sort of started over. So the first 11 years that I was in office as tribal chairman, they weren't able to pay me. While I was in office as vice chairman in the 70s, I worked for an intertribal group. And of course, the reason that we had an intertribal group is that the federal government didn't believe Indian tribes were capable of managing federal grant money in the 70s. So the leftover programs from the Johnson administration's great Great Society, yeah.
I see.
So,
Rocky,
I'm going on too long.
I hate to interrupt you, but I know that we've got audience members with questions.
Okay, well, I'll go to this. I went to our tribe, and we basically, we were the primary focus of the 1953 Indian removal, where the government paid people to move to California and move to so we had 2,000 Potawatomis within 30 miles of Bakersfield because they were all roughnecks from the Seminole oil boom. So anyway, the government of the tribe the people of the tribe just dispersed. And so when I took office, and we didn't have any money and we didn't have many prospects, the only thing that was left to do was to convince the tribe that instead of depending on the government, and instead of taking what earnings the tribe would ever generate, that we would take those monies and invest them in education.
Yeah.
And we fund 2,000 college scholarships a semester,
Yeah.
and we just placed the first 2 physicians that we started as college freshmen,
Yeah.
and they went all the way through medical school in our clinics. And we started creating opportunity.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
That's the main thing. It's creating
Right.
opportunity, because there was no opportunity is
Right.
why everyone left. I mean,
Yeah.
drinking water aside.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that tremendously. I do want to get the audience. I do want to get the audience in, and so much of this that you've heard, and we just have a couple minutes for questions, is really understanding that size can be a part of contributing to the solution, that you create opportunity where there's not been opportunity before, that you focus on place-based initiatives that are going to develop this pipeline to remove some of the disparities that we've experienced. But let's get to your questions, and maybe I know we've got some microphone runners. If we can take a couple of questions, we'll start there. And I see a hand in the back right here. So I'm going to take 3 questions. We'll do this hand here, and then we got a hand here.
Good afternoon, and thank you, panel, for your participation. This has been really wonderful. This question is for Jennifer. Relative to all of the investment that you all have put into technology, do you work closely with the technical colleges in your respective locations as well to help bring people into the pipeline, or is it solely the business that really is the forerunner for all the technological advancement and training that you all do?
Yeah, I think so.
Jen, let's take a couple of questions first. So I've got a question right in here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And then we'll go ahead and get one more question set up over here. Good.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about, we talked a lot about P-Tech and some other things, but the big buzzword now, and really it's a great investment, is in the apprenticeship programs.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious what your companies might be doing with apprenticeships and how you see them as part of your business model going forward.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And one last question that's over here. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Lisa McGill. I sit in a lot of conversations around racial justice and then also around workforce development. I'm curious about you working around the structural barriers instead of just programs and how you deal with that. So racism, genderism, whatever you want to call it.
Great. So first, Jen, maybe the question for you about technical colleges and how IBM works with technical colleges.
Sure. So I think the thing with new-collar jobs, as we would describe them, is that the talent for that comes from a lot of different sources. As we build artificial intelligence and cloud computing, the technical skills that we need are just changing very, very rapidly. And so we need to be training people up for those and the jobs that come in the chapter after that. So that takes place through community colleges. We have great partnerships with 70 community and technical colleges across the U.S. We hire heavily out of those, and we're hiring in really new locations. But it also takes place through apprenticeships. It takes place through the P-Tech model. It takes place through online learning, right? So the people that we're hiring are really getting their skills in a lot of different ways. We're interested in investing not just early on in people's career, but also thinking about lifelong learners. So whether that's investing in our own workforce, or thinking about, you mentioned veterans. We know veterans come home with very unique sets of skills. One area that has been hugely valuable to us is training veterans in cybersecurity. So we've done certification programs in I2, which is our security platform, and have trained over 500 veterans and have made a commitment to hire 2,000 veterans in the U.S. over the next 4 years. So I think there's a lot of different strains. Technical college is definitely one of them, but all of those different places. And there's no one model. Just like there's no one sector that can solve for this, there's no one model that's going to be a fit for everybody. So how do we kind of tackle it in a lot of different interesting ways?
Could I?
Yeah, please.
How do you, and I'm facing this, how do you modify that between the millennial and the Gen Xer?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a big transition for us. I mean, I'm part of the silent generation, and the born during World War II kind of. But the Gen X folks are completely different in a lot of ways in the way they learn, their perspective on their jobs, and I mean, whether you live to work, work to live kind of thing.
Right.
Millennials are something that we're really struggling to adapt to. And
So how do we modify that?
So there's different ways, right?
Yeah.
We know that millennials are very focused on being lifelong learners. There's a lot of different models. One of the things that we've recently embraced is digital badges, which is a really, really popular concept in the amongst millennials. So as you're learning skills, getting badges, getting certification for individual skills in a really modular way. So we've embraced that at IBM. I think we have over 90,000 employees who have earned digital badges in a variety of different areas. But we've recently taken a step to take that one step further and brokered a partnership with Northeastern University to say, could these digital badges, because IBM is an industry leader in data analytics, could the skills taught here actually apply for external credit toward your master's degree in data science and data analytics? And so how are we componentizing the learning and really breaking it down into specific and concrete skills?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I think about an IBM workforce versus a McDonald's workforce, and I think the question about gender and diversity and millennials, right? I mean, all of those people work, at McDonald's restaurants. So, for us, it's really, and maybe this is just me personally, like how do we expose people in our restaurants to what's out there, right? So I was at the session before, and the woman from Samsung talked about, I wrote it down, orbital welders. I have absolutely no idea what an orbital welder is, and I'm assuming most people in our restaurants have no idea what an orbital welder is, right?
Yeah.
But she said, starting salary could be pretty close to 6 figures. Wouldn't it be cool if we could tell people working at McDonald's restaurants, hey, there's this job called an orbital welder, and they need X number of them in X city, and we'll help you pay for the certificate that you need for the community college so that you can then go into that position. So, I think it's, so, what comes next, right? So digital badge is very cool.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily where our workforce is, right? So how do we lift them up, help lift them up to get them to that level so that they can actually participate in those kinds of opportunities?
Yeah.
So I could have this conversation all day with these folks, but I want to close, and Shawni, I'm going to ask you to take the last word, because that question about the structural barriers and the work that you're doing in El Paso and in Newark, I think, is so important at addressing some of those structural barriers. Could you talk a bit about that, and we're going to close. You've got the last word right here.
Lots of pressure.
No pressure.
Well, I think, we all know that, in 30 years, this country will be majority minority. And I think that, a lot of the social issues that we're grappling with today is the reality of that switch and that change. So from a business perspective, if, our future customer base, if our future talent pipeline are populations who have had, decades, years, hundreds of years of systemic barriers that they're facing, it's imperative for us to contribute to that and to not be honest about it, not to be able to face it head on, does a disservice to the solutions that all of you guys are working to address. So at Prudential, we're a company that we're housed in one of the poorest major cities in the United States. So the issues of race and class confront us on a daily basis. We can't shy away from it. You step out the door of your building and you're confronted with it. We as a company have chosen to stay in our community and to be an active member of grappling with that. But it means looking at solutions at a system level. It means having an honest conversation with our senior leaders. And it means really looking at what are the systemic barriers and how do we as a community address them. So we do that by investing in intermediaries, really looking at collective action strategies, anchor strategies, identifying how we can collectively work together with others to move the bar on these issues. But like I said, I think it starts with confronting these issues and having an honest conversation about them and acknowledging them, and then proactively partnering with others for solutions.
I want to invite my colleague, Mary Helen Petrus from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, to come up on stage. And as she does so, will you join me in thanking Rocky and Shawni and Jen and Lisa?
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, and good afternoon, everybody. That was a very interesting panel, at least from my perspective. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Mona Murshid. She is the president of Generation, a global youth employment nonprofit founded by McKinsey and Company, where Mona is a senior partner. Generation trains and places disconnected youth in jobs, and as many of you know, the Federal Reserve System has been interested and concerned about youth employment for some time. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, for example, is very interested in employment outcomes for non-college bound youth. I'm looking forward to hearing about Mona's organization, its early, very impressive results, and her thoughts on new ways of driving investments to workforce development and youth employment. Her full bio is in the mobile app. I encourage you to read it. And with that, I'm going to welcome Mona up to the stage.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here and for all of us to talk about a topic that is very close to all of our hearts. At the outset, let me just begin by saying that for any workforce program, there are, at least in my mind, 5 elements that constitute the Holy Grail. So one is that it produces employment, high levels of employment. 2 is that it enables young people to have longer retention in job than they would otherwise have, and also faster career promotion than they would otherwise have. 3rd is that it actually results in significant and sustained personal and financial well-being for the learner. 4th is that it also produces ROI for the employer with regards to business performance. And then lastly, that you can do all of that in a cost-effective and scalable way. Right? And if we had workforce programs that could do all of that, then I'm not sure that we would all be here. So let me just begin. There we go. Let me just begin by saying, wearing my so I do wear 2 hats. I think I share that with a few of you as well. So with my McKinsey hat, we had begun doing research in 2012, where we had looked at over 150 youth employment programs across 25 countries, including the US. We had surveyed 17,000 employers, education providers, young people across 14 countries, all trying to get at what does it take in order to really get underneath this challenge that's consuming all of us here. And without getting into all of the detail, essentially what we found was that there are tremendous youth employment programs in the world. The challenge is twofold. One is indeed around the scale, and that is often linked to cost, because things that are very high cost per student are just difficult to be able to continuously replicate. And those programs that are the most effective, meaning that they are demand driven, so they train and place young people in jobs, they are often the smallest. So it's hundreds of young people as opposed to hundreds annually, as opposed to thousands, let alone the tens of thousands and millions that need that support. And those programs that reach the greatest scale tend to be very supply-driven, meaning they train you and then off you go and Godspeed in terms of whether or not you're actually able to find a job or not. So what we were first trying to do is to say, well, what would it take in order to have a demand-driven program that recruits, trains, and places young people in careers, and at the same time can be cost-effective? So that was one part of the question. And then second was really around the ROI. And I'll say that for many programs, and I was delighted to hear that you're now looking at PTech and what's happened over the last 6 years. There are many programs today that beyond whether or not you were employed immediately following the program, that's pretty much all that data that's there. So whether you are still in job 6 months out, a year out, what actually happened to your income, what actually happened in terms of your financial and personal well-being, don't know. Right? And part of it is it's very difficult to track, particularly for vulnerable, fragile populations. It's very difficult to track. But it's very also difficult to be able to continue to say that these programs have impact unless that evidence is in place. And then for the employer, likewise, very few programs are actually able to say, here is the difference in ROI for the employer. And I was very excited to see that today's session began with a focus on the employer. And so I do want to linger on that just a bit. I mean, when you ask employers, do you know the ROI of your training programs? First of all, only about 1 to 2 people in 10 has an answer for that question. Second, 66% of them would say, if I did know what the ROI was, I would invest more in education and training. And over 50% plus would say, this is the biggest barrier to actually investing in education and training. So there is something very fundamental about in order to successfully lift a young person from one trajectory and put them onto a different trajectory, you have to be able to prove economic value to the employer. That's the only way to sustainably and scalably do that. And that's a belief that we hold very dear. And so that actually is what propelled Generation. McKinsey, about 2.5 years ago, created an independent nonprofit. Very first time that McKinsey's done that. It's called Generation. And Generation, and I'm going to put on my Generation hat now. So Generation recruits, trains, and places young people in careers. And then once they're on the job, we then measure the ROI for both our graduates and the employers. So we've been at it now, as I mentioned, for 2.5 years. Today, we have 15,000 graduates. We're in 5 countries, US, India, Spain, Kenya, and Mexico. We're in 55 cities, 126 locations. And we work today across 20 professions, spanning 4 sectors. So healthcare, tech, customer service and sales, and skilled trades. So we literally have everything from certified nurse assistant to financial and insurance sales to robotics. And we do that because you have very different learner profiles. You know, in the US, our learner is typically a GED holder or a diploma holder, facing significant levels of adversity, from poverty to single parenthood to domestic sexual abuse. And their reality is extremely different than that of our young people in Spain, who are actually bachelor degree holders and master degree holders. And it is that way because it's 40 to 50% youth unemployment. And so what we seek to do with Generation is to support the unemployed and underemployed population that is in most need in each of our countries. And that's very much has resulted in this type of diversity of our programs. We have young people that come to us who have 6th grade literacy and numeracy, even though they do have a diploma. And that means that you can, that's the base, bless you, that is the base for the, I just cast more attention on you. That's the foundation for going into a certified nurse assistant program. To go into IT help desk, you'd have to be at 10th grade literacy numeracy. So we flex to that and then are able to carry them forward from that point. So let me just speak a little bit about where we are with Generation today. So above and beyond this, we have 1,600 employer partners. And most importantly, we have outcomes and ROI. So we have an 83% job placement rate upon completion of the program. The 6-month retention rate in the first job that we have placed our graduates in is over 70%. And then we have another 10 to 15% that have moved on to their second job at that point. We can show ROI in terms of income. So in the US, for example, our graduates are earning 3 to 4 times in income what they were earning prior to Generation. And globally, India, for example, is 6x what they were earning prior to Generation. Globally, our graduates have now earned over $50 million in salary. For our employer partners, we can now demonstrate, for over 88% of our employers, longer retention, faster speed to promotion, higher productivity, and higher quality outcomes. And so this is very much the learning ground that we've been going through, as with many of you, trying to find what could a solution look like. So I'll just very briefly describe how Generation works. And it's very much geared towards how do we take the barriers that exist across the value chain from a young person showing up to actually being employed and being successful, and literally blowing up each of those barriers through the program. And as I do this, I do want to, I think it was Shawni, you said that it's important to be holistic and systematic. We very much agree. And Alfredo, you had mentioned, employers look at entry-level talent as a cost as opposed to a value. We very much agree with that. And you'll see strands of the approach that directly tackle that. So the very first thing we do when we enter into a community is to figure out what are the target professions, and they are all middle-skill jobs that are a livable wage, and that they're either high scarcity or high churn. And very deliberately those two, because that's where you can create economic value for the employer. And so we work with a consortium of employers in every city to pre-confirm vacancies for those particular target professions. Pre-confirming a vacancy means that a real vacancy exists where if someone had the requisite skill, they would be hired. It's not a paper vacancy. Once we've created that consortium, then the next thing we do is what we call activity mapping. So we had the observation from the past research that when you go to employers and you ask them, well, what skills do you need? Frankly, it's a fruitless question. Right? You will either get 2 things or you'll get 100 things. Neither of these is helpful. And so what we do is we focus on what are the day-to-day activities that you will do in your job. And we observe that by shadowing, let's say it's web designers. We'll shadow web designers who are considered to be high, medium, and low performers in their role as deemed by their supervisors. We do that across employers. And so what we're seeking to do is to say, here are the 30 activities that you do in your day as a web designer. And of those activities, there are actually 5 to 6 that really differentiate between a high performer and a low performer in the job. And then here's how those activities actually trace back to productivity and quality outcomes. That then becomes the basis for our curriculum. And so we create the curriculum that is anywhere from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. It is in boot camp format. And it's anchored in these breakdown moments. It is over 70% practicum. So it's simulation of many different kinds. So in person, clinicals where that's relevant, digital simulations in some cases. And what we are seeking to do is to provide repeat and intensive practice in these activities so that when you are on the job, you will be at peak performance for your role and for your tenure. And you will be immediately delivering value to your employer. And because you are excelling, there is a very important feedback effect for you in terms of confidence in the job and the ability to progress and to work well with your peers. So once we have those activities, we do at that point then look at skills. And we identify what are the technical skills, behavioral skills, and mindsets that you need to perform each of those activities at a high level. In parallel to the boot camp, we offer social support services. And this is very important for the US programs. And I will say, social support services, which is everything from mentorship to weekly stipend to transportation allowance, access to childcare. In the US, 40% of our females are single moms. This is critical for them to be able to participate. So in the US, social support services is 35% of our OPEX. It is less than 2% of our OPEX in our other countries. And I say that because, initially, we were all a bit stunned when we looked at that, just given GDP per capita levels. But it actually makes intuitive sense. In India, Kenya, Mexico, there's a friends and family network. And your friends and family will take care of you when you are in the training. And then when you get on the job, your income goes to the household. That does not exist in the US. This is a much more fragmented, atomized society. And so as a result, there is no friends and family for our learners. It's them, and they actually have dependents. And so it becomes critical. If that social support service is not there, they will not be able to participate. And you cannot learn if you're wondering where your child is going to eat that night. You cannot learn. So once our young people complete the program, then they are able to interview with our employer partners. And then once they're on the job, then we measure the ROI. And the ROI for our learners is personal and financial well-being. So it's everything from income to can you afford a car, can you buy a home, your healthcare outcomes, your engagement with your home, with your community, your level of optimism. Because all of these things affect your well-being and your ability to participate. And then we also look, obviously, at the employer, and that's productivity, quality, retention, speech, and promotion. And I'll say that sometimes there are cases where the productivity and quality metrics are obvious. And so for example, if it's sales, then it's time to first sale, it's your average sales volume, et cetera. But sometimes we've had to work with employers to create metrics. So for example, for our certified nurse assistant program, when the most scarce resource in a hospital is actually the nurse supervisor's time. If you can save her time, then that's value. And so what we've been able to do is to identify how much time does a generation CNA save her nurse supervisor versus peers. And long story short, it's about 35 minutes per shift, which you can then monetize, which you can translate into EBITDA, which then becomes a CEO issue. And so that's the chain which we seek to create. And I'll just say 2 more things, and then I'll pause so that we can go to questions. Generation is a methodology. So what we do is we embed generation in the institutions of the local community. So we have embedded in the US context in community colleges. We have embedded in nonprofits. We can embed in the employer. It's a method. So what generation does is we provide the curriculum, which is, so it's the content. So it's the curriculum, the technology tools. We do the quality assurance, which is everything from the recruitment protocols, the employment protocols, the onboarding of instructors, the weekly training of instructors. We do the data analytics, which is ROI baselining for our employer partners, the weekly dashboarding of program performance, the predictive analytics based on this person's profile, what types of services and support do we need to provide to them. And then we do the employer mobilization. But the way that we scale is by embedding through others. And that's a very important part of the model. And then lastly, we're ultimately designed to be self-financing. So generation today is 50% self-financing through employer fees, government fees, and in the US context, it's essentially money through the web. And then in some cases, learner fees. And then it's catalytic philanthropy to be able to support the creation of the ROI case for new professions, new cities. But then once we prove it, then we're able to flip a switch, because then we can say, we're essentially the entry-level talent coming in is creating this much value, and so now here's the amount that employer you take on to cover the OpEx. So I'll just pause here, but that's essentially how generation works. Actually, sorry, I should just probably share one more thing, which is cost per employed day. We have had many discussions whereby there's a conversation around what is the cost per student. And our view has always been, well, cost per student is part of the story, but there's also employment rate, and there's retention rate. And until you actually know how all 3 of those work, you don't actually know the value of a program. And so that's the bar that we hold ourselves to. This is cost per employed day just at a 6-month point, but obviously as you stretch this out. And you'll see the reason why the US is at $25, 35% of that is social support services. And we are continuously, so our goal is to get cost per employed day to be less than $5 for the US. And we are well on our way to doing that. But if I were to ask you for a very important baselining on metric, it's being able to support programs to not just look at cost per student, not just look at employment, and not just look at retention to the extent that retention is gathered. It's to look at it together, because that's when you truly understand what value is. So I'll just pause here. Happy to do questions.
Can you please expand on your training capabilities?
Sorry, where are you?
Yes. Can you please expand on the training capabilities and cost and how you are going about providing that to your participants?
What are our training capabilities? Sure. So essentially, so we have a curriculum. So we have an in-house curriculum team that also does the instructor training. And so what we do is, as I mentioned, the way we create our curriculum is through the activity map that is linked to the ROI levers. That becomes the basis. If it's, we will never train anyone in anything if it's not linked to creating value at the employer. Or if it is not linked to them being able to be high performers in the job. So that is the first piece. So we have a team that does that. And then we then onboard and train our instructors. And so as I mentioned, in community college context, that might be adjunct faculty. It might, in some communities, we will ourselves hire and train instructors that are permanent generation employees. And then because the boot camps are fast, they are, as I meant, they're anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks, So we also at times will have cameras in our classrooms so that we can literally see at any point in time what is happening, because you have to have consistency of performance. You cannot wait 3 weeks and realize, oh, we had a slip up in week 1. The cascade is too big. So it's a highly managed process to make sure that our young people are learning what they need to learn and that they are achieving mastery of the required concepts every week. If you fall behind in week 1, we will swarm you. If you are still behind in week 2, then we will take you out and then address whatever is getting in the way and then put you into the next cycle. And then you asked about cost per student. So cost per student is anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000. Varies by the profession, and as I mentioned, 35% of that is the social support services. And that number can come down based on what the community is able to offer. So if a community college can give us classroom space, then that means that space we don't have to rent. If we can use instructors that are part of an institution, then those are instructors that don't need to be hired.
This is fascinating. So my name is Betsy Beeman. I run an organization called Coastal Enterprises, and we work statewide in Maine and then nationally through our financing subsidiaries. How does this model work in rural regions? We have 1.3 million people in Maine. We have 8,000 to 12,000 disconnected youth who are not in school and not in the workplace between the age of 18 and 24. And I'm challenged in a sort of small business state and in a state where our young people who are disconnected are all over the state, how one makes a model like this work. Love to hear what your experience has been.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US right now, we are in 10 cities. So 10 of our cities, 10 of our 55 are in the US. And they are a combination of either large cities or middle cities. So we are not today in the US in rural areas. That being said, in India, we are in very rural areas, and we actually have migration. So what we do is that we identify a population in a village catchment area. But it's with a clear understanding that they're migrating to a tier 3 city or a tier 2 city. So we will train them in place, and then migrate them, and then give them a practicum, and then migrate them to the ultimate destination. So the summation here is generation. I want to be very clear. Generation is not the solution to every unemployment problem. Generation is a solution where there are jobs in the community that are not being filled, or where there is very high degrees of churn, and where you have a population that is ready to learn. They're facing significant challenges in their lives, but they have a hunger and the fire in the belly to be able to do better for themselves and for their families. And when we have that combination, then this model is very effective in getting them to a completely different trajectory. If you're in a rural situation where there are no jobs, then there are, or if there are jobs, but it's very fragmented. I mean, for example, in Spain, that's probably a good example. So Spain, the vast majority of our employers are small enterprises. And so our employers are literally hiring 1 to 2 of our graduates. And so we have to do a lot more on employer mobilization. But what it requires is, though, an ability to, let me just say, have a more retail approach to being able to get employers on board. And you just have to have enough consistency in profession demand to make that work. But so long as the jobs are there, then irrespective of whether it's rural or whether it's more urban or whether it's somewhere in between, the model can work. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Mona. Very inspiring presentation, really appreciate it. Lots of food for thought. At this point, we're at the closing of the day, and I'd like to invite Heath Prince, Director of the Ray Marshall Center for the Study of Human Resources at the University of Texas, to join me on the stage to give closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heath Prince. I'm the Director of the Ray Marshall Center here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for making the trip down. And on behalf of the Ray Marshall Center, the LBJ School, and the University of Texas, welcome to Austin. I have a few brief housekeeping notes, but I would be remiss if I didn't take advantage of my time at the podium to say a few things before we get to the housekeeping. First of all, thanks. I owe personal thanks to President Finvez for his generous and gracious support, to Angela Evans, Dean Angela Evans at the LBJ School. Without her leadership and encouragement, I cannot say how sane I might be at this point in the process. Alana Burney at the Ray Marshall Center and Annabelle Gall at the LBJ School, thank you for all the heavy lifting. I owe you guys a drink in a few minutes. Steve, Todd, Roy, Carl, Randy, you guys are awesome partners to work with. It's been a real honor and a real privilege to work with you. And you really illustrate how many hands do indeed make light work. And finally, to Chris King, my friend and my mentor, thank you for this opportunity. And to Ray Marshall, my inspiration for the last 20 some odd years. So day one is off to a great start. In the conversations that I've been hearing in the sessions, in passing in the hallways, it's clear that this conference is hitting on the critical topics facing our field and facing the population that our field is designed to serve. I think the employer panel did a wonderful job of framing the employer perspective. And Mona, you've raised some really provocative, thought-provoking issues about a population, I don't even know where you are anymore, but about a population that I think really merits a great deal more attention than it gets. So thank you for that. I want to just quickly build on something that Eric said, focusing on disparities in the labor market. This will be brief, but bear with me. The Economic Policy Institute has a calculator that allows you to determine, to estimate anyway, what it costs to live in any given place. So for Austin, $64,657. Median income in Austin is about $57,500. So somewhere just north of that. More than 50% of the folks living here are not making enough to live a decent life. We're talking about meeting basic needs, not frills. The poverty rate in Austin is 18%. Not great, not horrible, but if you go 2 miles east of here, on the other side of I-35, 1 in 4 people are requiring food assistance on any given day. Our unemployment rate, we're very proud of our very low unemployment rate in Austin, 3.4%. But again, travel just 2 miles east. Folks in those zip codes, it's double there. And if you factor in the number of people who simply stopped looking for work, it's closer to 15 or 20%. I put these out there simply to remind us of why it is that we do what we do. And I'm greatly encouraged by this conference, which I'm certain will be a pivotal conference in our field. I think with all of the talent in the room, there is the potential to crowdsource some really interesting solutions to some of these persistent problems that we've been dealing with for quite some time. All right, now on to the housekeeping. Day 2, breakfast is at 7:30. The sessions begin at 8:30. Should you need assistance with the conference app, it's available at the registration desk. However, the registration desk tomorrow will be on the 3rd floor. We're on the 2nd floor currently. And finally, I have the happy task of dismissing us to the reception. Directions. There are staff around here who can give you directions. There are signs pointing you in the right direction. It is not more than a couple of 100 yards from where we're sitting right now. Do bring your conference badge with you. And I have to say that we are so very lucky to have gotten use of the Blanton Museum. It's a wonderful, beautiful space. And I've been told just recently that there are specialty cocktails. and there's plenty of great artwork to be had. So I'll close there. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at the reception and at the conference. And yeah, thanks.